I've been aware of your St. Monica prayer group and see you there praying, and so this is good. It gives me a chance to spend a little time with you, and thank you for those prayers, though I suspect that if you're involved in a St. Monica prayer group, it's a pretty selfish prayer, right? You're after your own kids. Is it correct that it started primarily because of the desire to pray people back into the practice of the faith? Is that right? Okay. Right. So that desire certainly is what fills our hearts, and I know since I've been back at Christ the King, I've talked a few times about that question, and it's a question that's shared really everywhere. When I visited all the churches around the state, I heard it over and over again, the desire to reconnect. So it's always in people's minds, these questions. How can we connect? What is it that we can do? And so certainly we can talk about situations and questions that come up, things that you may have done, but I would say there's two things that come to my mind that we need to be really conscious of if we're going to try to reconnect or try to invite people back into faith. And you know, the first concept is that we have to be aware that it takes a witness. Okay, it takes a witness. We have to be a witness of faith. Now that seems fairly obvious, and I hear people say, well, that's what I tried to do. But when I ask people, well, what have you tried to do? How have you tried to be a witness? I usually get some version of, well, I tell them they should go to church. That is not what it means to be a witness. Okay, that's not witnessing to anything. So it's one of the hardest things. Of course, it's probably the hardest part of being a parent, period, right? As your kids get older, you can't just tell them what you know they should do. And the more you try to tell them what you know they should do, the more they resist because you're telling them that's what they should do. So it's a difficulty. So just think of it in terms of witness. So if I'm a witness, what am I witnessing to? Well, we have to be witnessing to our own faith. We have to be sharing our faith. So that's the first thing I would say to think about is, what am I witnessing? What am I inviting them to? Telling them to go to church, it just kind of reinforces this sense of an obligation that they don't already feel, and so it's not going to motivate them suddenly. As I have said before, nobody has told me the magic number. Once I told them, 500 times, they finally gave in and they went back. So it doesn't work no matter how many times. So it has to be a witness to something. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it probably would help us to learn a little bit of logic. Okay, so logic is a part of this as well. What I mean by that is that whether we're aware of it or not, we all have a certain logic to what we are thinking. And if we're not aware of it, it's still happening, but we're not ever going to improve it. So to improve how we're trying to convince people, we have to be aware of our logic. So that means the basics of logic are, I arrive at a conclusion because of some premises that get me there. And the reason I bring this up is because the conclusion in the context of this group is getting your children and grandchildren to practice their faith. And so when you're trying to get them there, you are trying to arrive at this conclusion. But the longer you argue about the final result, the conclusion, without success, the more you should realize I need to change my tactics. They're not going to be convinced of the conclusion until the premises make sense. Okay, that's the most basic idea about the logic. So if I'm not getting the result that I want, the conclusion that I'm hoping for, I have to step back and ask, what are my premises? And then ultimately, I can't convince anybody of anything until I figure out a starting point that is common ground. So I have to think back, what are all the reasons why I conclude this? What are all the reasons? And I have to figure out, well, where do I have common ground with the person I'm trying to convince? Because I have to work from there. So, for example, I had somebody recently talking about the various moral issues in the church today and all kinds of things that people are confused about in terms of right or wrong. And they were arguing about, well, we need to be clear on what the truth is. That we live in a time where people want to deny basic truths about things. And that's true. The problem is, the person that was arguing that we should speak more clearly the truth had as a premise, we believe truths come from Jesus. And as another premise, what Jesus says matters. That's a basic premise for our Catholic moral teaching. What Jesus says matters. Well, if you're trying to convince somebody who doesn't believe that, you are never going to convince them about any moral question. If your starting point is what Jesus says matters, and they don't know or care what Jesus says, then no amount of appealing it to the truth is going to convince them. Because the most basic premise, the place that you stand on first of all, is not shared. So one of the mental exercises to try to do is to really dig down and ask yourself, why do I do what I do? What motivates me? And that takes some self-awareness. It takes some digging. The good part of it is we have a tendency to forget about our foundation. And probably all of us need to give a little more attention to tending to our foundation. If we neglect our foundation, it can start to crumble. And if our foundation gets weak, then everything else is going to be weak as a result. So we need to think down to, well, why do I do what I do? Anytime that you get into kind of a moral debate, and this could be part of the difficulty that you face talking to your children, your grandchildren, you know, they want to bring up, well, the church says this thing and that's not fair. Why is the church hateful, judgmental, whatever they might say? They want to get to, well, why does the church say this? So one of the questions that we can ask back, rather than trying to come up with a list of answers, is to ask, well, how do you decide what's right and wrong in the first place? How do you even decide how to make a judgment about this thing? And then it can kind of take everything off of the offensive and start getting down to, well, where is our common ground exactly? There will be some common ground. There will be something that can be understood as a basis for making judgments. And if the person you're talking to does not care what Jesus says as a moral basis for what we do, if they don't have any understanding of God as loving, well, then all of your effort has to be to try to get them there before you try to get them to some other kind of conclusion. Again, the idea of logic. If we don't share the premises, our work has to be on coming to share the premise, or we'll never get to the conclusion. And our premise has to be that we believe that the relationship with God matters, that what Jesus teaches is the source of the truth that will set us free. And what you are witnessing to is bringing them into that kind of relationship with God that can change their perspective. Because, as you probably have experienced, you're not going to just discover the thing that changes everybody's mind. You're not going to argue your way into a different understanding. Instead, there has to be a look at how can I bring them close to Jesus. So if we look at the Gospels, that's what happens when people come close to Jesus. Their perspective about everything changes. Their perspective about their own life changes. Their perspective about what is of value in the world changes. And that's a change that does not come about because Jesus convinces them by his arguing, but he convinces them by the power of his love, by the witness of who he is. And then change can happen. St. Matthew is a good example of this. St. Matthew, who was a tax collector and a sinner who became an apostle, when Jesus encountered him, he didn't say, I got a deal for you. He didn't say, if you'll get these things in order in your life, then you can be my follower. He said, follow me. He brought him close. That's not to say that all the sins of Matthew didn't matter. It's not to say that it was okay that those things were part of his life. Jesus wanted those things changed. But he didn't lead with, change these things, and then. He led with, come to me. And when you start to see those things in your life in light of me, then suddenly those things seem different. And so we have to ask ourselves, how are we bringing them to Jesus? And the only way that we do that we can get to a shared premise about who Jesus is the witness of my life. Why does that matter to me? Why is my life different? Because Jesus is part of my life. How have I experienced meaning and freedom in life? Okay, one last thing I'll say about kind of the logic. One of the shared premises of being human is that we're trying to navigate life. One thing that your children and grandchildren are trying to do is navigate life. They're trying to figure out their place. They're trying to figure out what has meaning and value in their life. Those are questions that they want answered, that they are trying to navigate. The difference for a person of faith is to realize that what has meaning, what gives my life purpose, is my relationship with God. That's what changes my perspective on my work, on my family, on my pastimes, on everything. And so the common ground is how to navigate life. What they have already concluded is that faith offers nothing to help navigate life. What you have concluded is faith offers everything to navigate my life. And so then the witness of your faith is about being really clear on how does my faith, my relationship with God, allow me to navigate my life, to see my purpose, to find meaning in what I do, to experience greater joys in the joys of my life, to find strength and consolation in the crosses of my life because of him. And so your homework would be, how clearly can you articulate that? How clearly can you articulate in your own story how your meaning, how your joys, how your crosses are all experienced in the light of who Jesus is? So then the conversation with them is about something that they care about, which is navigating life. And so these are the premises that we are trying to build so that we can arrive at the conclusion that practicing faith matters. And I get them there by not rational arguments, but by the witness of my life that understand the premises that I'm standing on. So that's a quick version of a couple of ideas. So are there any particular questions relating to this? It's a different question if they've lost faith in God, period, versus they've gone to another church altogether. Because if they've gone to another church altogether, they have probably a relationship with Jesus, and one of the reasons that they give is, for the first time I have a relationship with Jesus after all these years of being Catholic. So it is a little different thing, but it doesn't change that the only way to convince is to think about the logic. Okay, so you gave, for example, this talk that you listened to. So part of the question for you is, why did that have meaning to me? That's what I'm trying to understand. Why did it have meaning to me? And then so often when we are giving them things, it's because we are deciding this ought to convince you. Well, sometimes we're answering questions they're not asking. And it doesn't convince them because the argument that this thing I'm giving them is making isn't what their concern is even. So we still have to find the common ground. And so if you have somebody that has gone to a Protestant church, then the first thing that you have to do is not try to convince them how they were wrong. The very first thing you have to do is hear from them why that had so much meaning to them that they committed their life to it. Okay, but we get worried because they're not doing their Catholic thing anymore. And so my kind of approach to everything they're doing is it's all wrong, you got to get this right and come back. And what we have to do instead is say, no, there's something very right because you're committing your life to Jesus. Why? And they have to know that that matters, that we are happy that that's a part of their life. And so as we have that conversation about why, what is it that's been so meaningful to you, what we're trying to understand is still the question, how do you decide? And if they've gotten to the point where they say, I decide right and wrong, my practice based on Jesus, if that's our common ground now, well then it's because of what Jesus teaches that we have all the Catholic stuff. It's because of Jesus that we have the Eucharist, the Mass, the sacraments. And so the step then is for them to really celebrate the fact that now you are basing how you live your life on what Jesus says. So then let's look at what does Jesus really say. But part of it is again the idea of witness. There has to be some logic behind it. There is logic behind it. If we're not conscious of the logic, then we can't make any adjustments. And then we have to be a witness. And so if the perspective they feel is, I'm trying to convince you you're wrong, that's not going to get anywhere. If the perspective is, I'm so happy that we have this shared faith in Jesus, and I'm so grateful that you're helping me articulate why that matters to me, then let's talk about what does it mean to follow Jesus. It has to be communicated that we are seeking the same thing. Okay, in the back of our mind, we know that this leads to the Catholic Church for me. But to be Catholic is, in fact, to be seeking what does Jesus want. And so Catholics, we have to be a little cautious sometimes because some of the language that gets used in Protestant churches feels foreign to us, and so it feels wrong to us when in fact it's very right. So the language of a relationship with Jesus is language that's not so familiar to Catholics, but it's the right language. And so Catholics need to be able to think about faith in light of that relationship with Jesus. So we're establishing common ground, the same premise, and then asking, where does this take us? And because of what we believe about the Catholic Church, if our children have started practicing a Christian faith with great fervor, and we can stand with them and say, let's follow where Jesus leads us, well, then we've got all kinds of things in the Catholic Church. We've got John chapter 6, for example. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in me. Jesus says this. Okay, so, but again, I want to emphasize, you have to be aware of the tone of that conversation. If the tone of the conversation is, I'm going to convince you that you're wrong, we get defensive. And so we're less likely to concede, even if I agree with you, I'm not going to let you in because that means you won. But if our starting point is we're walking together to understand where is Jesus leading us, I'm less defensive. So all of those things contribute to those kinds of conversations. So here's what I would say. Again, what's my thought? I'm trying to get them to do something. That's not the starting point. Okay? So the starting point is not get them to do something. The starting point is why I do something. And then you let that lead to them making decisions. Okay, so it's so hard. We so badly want the result to be you do something, And they have to choose to do something. Okay, so I have to keep pulling back from that sense of, okay, I'm going to encourage you to go do whatever. No, instead, I'm going to invite you in to why this matters to me. And if we bring them into why this matters to us and they come into contact with Jesus more closely, then he's leading them to their next decision. Okay, and maybe their next decision isn't the next decision you wish they would take, but then we still have to resist because we do have to let them kind of navigate their way, and we continue to guide and support them. But they're going to be more open to us the more convinced they are. I'm not trying to convince you to do anything, but I'm trying to walk with you in understanding where's Jesus leading us. The more open that is, then the more opportunity we have to share faith, which could go from who Jesus is to why the Catholic practice is living how Jesus is.